I was deployed under Operation Midnight Lion, Mossad Field Directive 17B, Berlin Sector, coordinates redacted for national security. My clearance was Omega Black, with conditional access to Eastern Bloc archives. What began as a standard counterintelligence probe in the fractured shadow of the Cold War quickly transformed into something unspeakable. Berlin in those months was a city fractured not merely by walls of concrete, but by silence, suspicion, and abandoned districts that seemed to breathe with their own cold pulse. Soviet patrols circled like hungry wolves, while Western operatives hunted each other in alleyways choked with industrial smoke. I was issued standard reconnaissance gear, suppressed 9mm pistol, encrypted radio with rotating frequency lock, compact oxygen canisters, night vision optics, and ration packs calibrated for 72 hours. Each detail mattered, because precision was the only weapon against the unpredictable pressure of hostile territory and human treachery. The briefing was clinical. Locate the forgotten remnants of a Soviet-era research complex buried beneath the eastern quarter. Satellite reconnaissance suggested sealed bunkers untouched since the early 50s. New here? Welcome to Intel Uncovered, where chilling military horror stories come alive. Hit subscribe and step into the shadows with us. Intelligence hinted the site housed experimental technology. Nothing in the file suggested anything supernatural, only obsolete machinery awaiting dismantling. At the time, my mindset was trained rationalism. Every anomaly had a reason. Every failure of equipment was explained by faulty engineering. I trusted discipline, procedure, mathematics. That trust, I learned, was a fragile skin stretched thin across something far older and infinitely more patient. Berlin's ruins had a gravity. Brick shells leaned over cobblestones like broken teeth. Alleys whispered with echoes of artillery, and shadows clung to the craters where families once lived. It was not memory I felt in those streets, but an oppressive weight pressing into my chest. I recall the night insertion through a rain-choked district where light seemed smothered before reaching the ground. Our boots struck waterlogged rubble, each impact sharp in the absence of natural noise. I heard only the rhythm of breathing through respirators, the faint hiss of compressed oxygen release. Official testimony demands clarity, yet there are moments clarity cannot contain. Even then, before the first descent, I felt patterns in the silence, a cadence in the broken glass underfoot, as if the city itself rehearsed the steps of something long awaiting recognition from us intruders. Berlin was no ordinary theater of operation. It was a crucible where Western intelligence services and Eastern operatives fought wars invisible to civilians, a city dense with dead drops, coded radio transmissions, and agents who disappeared as if erased by an unseen eraser across history's map. Our mission was framed in technical necessity. Soviet relic installations had to be cataloged, secured, and either dismantled or repurposed. The Cold War was not only a war of men and weapons, but also of forgotten vaults, dormant reactors, and projects buried under secrecy like corpses under ice. I received my directive in a room with no windows, lit by one tungsten lamp that seemed to hum louder than the officer's voice. The order was clear: infiltrate, assess, and extract evidence before rival services reached it. The risk of capture was secondary to the risk of disclosure. If Moscow's archives contained new weapons, Berlin's shadows contained their discarded failures. Our task was to sift among ghosts of machinery, among ruins of projects whispered about in fragments, attempts to bend physics, to accelerate time, to shape matter into servants. None of this was confirmed, yet all were feared. The stakes extended beyond borders. Failure meant more than political fallout. My commanders warned of an uncontrolled cascade, classified material feeding nuclear arsenals, or worse, destabilizing entire regions with technologies no one understood. It was a mission where silence and shadows carried more weight than bullets or treaties. Survival was never the guarantee. Documentation mattered most. We were instructed to record, transcribe, and transmit. If we vanished, the mission was still to succeed in fragments of evidence. Behind the cold operational logic, I felt the hidden implication. Some discoveries might be too dangerous to bring back alive. There were 5 of us on the ground team. Each one was a specialist, selected for their expertise, and each one carried their own quiet weight, like stones hidden in backpacks. Our roles were clear, yet as we moved through the night, so much remained unsaid. First was Captain Barak, the team leader. He had been with Mossad for over 20 years, a soldier who spoke rarely, preferring action over words. His calm exterior hid a mind that could predict movements like a chess master calculating every possible future. But in the shadows I saw his hands tremble. Next, Sergeant Shira, our medic. Practical, scientific, and a rock under pressure, Shira had seen horrors in the field. Burnt bodies, chemical exposure, the mangled aftermath of operations gone wrong. But this was different. I could see it in her eyes during the briefings. She did not believe in ghosts, but something was shifting in her thoughts. Then there was Lieutenant Avner, the demolitions expert. His hands were precise, his focus sharp, but there was a reckless edge to him that kept the rest of us on our toes. The fact that he had volunteered for this mission despite knowing the risks of the unknown unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Communications specialist Leah was our lifeline. Every signal passed through her hands, encrypted messages, dead drops, radio bursts. Her mind was a matrix of codes, frequencies, and cryptographic languages. But she was quiet on that first night, her usual analytic sharpness replaced with a subtle unease, as though the air itself was a signal of something wrong. Finally, there was myself, the field operative. My training had prepared me for many things: stealth, combat, sabotage. But what awaited us in the labyrinth of Berlin's forgotten bunkers, those technological relics hidden beneath layers of history, I could not have anticipated. We were a well-oiled machine, or at least we had been. On the surface there was professionalism, the sort of camaraderie that comes with shared missions and a mutual understanding of the stakes. Beneath that, though, I felt a tension in each step, a sense that the walls were watching, listening. The mission briefing took place in a sterile, underground operations room beneath our safe house. The flickering lights above cast harsh shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the hum of computers and the acrid scent of cold coffee. The officer in charge, Major Elias, kept his tone flat, his eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. He outlined the objective in precise detail: infiltrate the abandoned Soviet facility, extract any classified materials or technological blueprints, and ensure no evidence was left behind. The facility had been a center for biological and nuclear research, but the real focus was on something more elusive, hidden deep within the bowels of the complex. Be mindful of the security measures, Major Elias warned, pointing to a map of the facility displayed on the wall. Infrared sensors, pressure plates, and electromagnetic locks. It's old, but functional. The Soviets were thorough in their design. Your primary task is to document everything. Extraction will be handled after your report. I listened, taking in the details, but something about the mission felt off. I had been briefed on many operations before, but there was a subtle difference in the way Major Elias spoke this time. The words were crisp, but his voice carried a faint edge, like a man who had seen something he could not explain and didn't want to. The rest of the team gathered around the table, their expressions unreadable as we exchanged looks. Barak's face was unreadable, his eyes scanning the maps and projections. Shira, always calm, nodded without a word, while Avner tapped his fingers on the edge of the table, his mind already focused on the demolition tasks that awaited. Leah's fingers danced over her notepad, but her eyes kept drifting to the corner of the room, as if expecting something to move. Remember, Major Elias continued, his voice lowering, this is not just a retrieval mission. What you find down there may be more than you can comprehend, but it is your duty to bring it back, no matter what. There was a long pause. I could feel it, an undercurrent of something unsaid, something unacknowledged in the room. A weight pressing down on all of us, as though the walls themselves knew things we did not. Major Elias finished with one final remark, almost whispered. The Soviets abandoned this place for a reason. We gathered our gear in silence. Each item, radio, weapon, pack, felt heavier than it should. The preparation took longer than expected, but there was something almost ritualistic about it. The air was thick with expectation, with the knowledge that we were about to cross a threshold. Outside, the cold wind cut through the alleyways of Berlin, and the distant sound of a siren echoed through the ruins. The mission was about to begin, but the question lingered in the back of my mind. What had the Soviets left behind, and what would we find in the darkness of that forgotten place? The ride to the target site was a tense one. We moved through Berlin's wrecked streets in a blacked-out transport, the engine's low hum blending with the occasional crackle from the encrypted comms. The city was a hushed ruin, still caught in the grip of its fractured history, and every street lamp seemed to flicker with warning. The moon hung low, casting long shadows over the broken buildings and empty streets. There was a strange, oppressive stillness to it all, almost as if the city were holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, something to break. We navigated through zones of post-war abandonment, areas where even the locals had long ceased to venture. Barak was at the wheel, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror as if he could see past the walls of the car. Avner sat in the passenger seat, flipping through a manual of explosives with a practiced hand. He spoke little, his mind already several steps ahead, calculating what we would need to breach the facility's heavily fortified entrances. Behind us, Leah ran a final diagnostics check on the communications equipment. She muttered softly to herself, adjusting frequencies and toggling encryption switches, but her gaze kept darting to the sides of the road. There was something unspoken in her posture, a nervous energy that none of us could ignore. Shira sat quietly, eyes closed, arms folded across her chest. Her hands twitched occasionally, as if she were fighting against the urge to check her medical supplies. She had not said much since the briefing, but her silence spoke volumes. Something was gnawing at her too, something she couldn't explain. I sat across from her, watching the others in the dim light of the vehicle. There was a growing sense of unease, a nagging feeling at the back of my skull, but I couldn't place it. It was irrational, an instinct I couldn't justify. But when the world feels wrong, it is often the quietest moments that signal the beginning of something terrible. We crossed into the heart of the sector, past the crumbling facades of old buildings, through narrow alleys where the air felt colder, denser. The transport's wheels crunched over the cobblestone streets, the sound sharp in the stillness. Outside, the buildings seemed to close in around us, their outlines dark and oppressive, as though the city itself was watching us, tracking our every movement. As we neared the site, the air grew heavier, more suffocating. The streets gave way to a sprawling, derelict industrial zone, the kind of place no one dared enter without reason. Barak slowed the vehicle as we approached the facility's perimeter, an old Soviet bunker, its concrete walls thick with the weight of decades of neglect. I could feel it now, the palpable shift in the atmosphere. The air tasted metallic, like the ozone before a storm. The hum of distant power lines was louder here, a deep, low frequency that vibrated in my chest. The site loomed ahead, abandoned for years, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as though it had never truly been empty. Leah checked the comms one last time, her hands steady but her expression tight. "All channels clear," she said, her voice low. "I'll keep monitoring, but there's nothing irregular yet." Barak nodded once and we began to disembark. The weight of our gear seemed heavier now, our every movement muffled by the unnatural quiet of the surroundings. The wind had died, leaving only the faintest echo of distant city life behind. We gathered at the entry point, a rusted steel door barely visible in the overgrown underbrush. Avner worked quickly with his tools, bypassing the old electronic locks with the skill of a man who had spent his life dismantling barriers. The door creaked open with a sickening groan, revealing a pitch-black interior. I stepped inside first, my boots crunching on broken glass and scattered debris. The others followed, our footsteps a strange counterpoint to the silence around us. The atmosphere was oppressive, thick, humid, as though the walls themselves exhaled something ancient, something forgotten. "Stay sharp," Barak's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the faint buzz of static in our earpieces. "We do this quick and quiet. Document everything, but don't engage unless absolutely necessary." As we descended into the heart of the bunker, I noticed the first unsettling sign, the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable. Decay, yes, but something older. Something not entirely of this world. The corridor stretched ahead of us, its walls damp and covered in layers of mold and grime. The floor was uneven, shifting beneath our feet, as if it had settled unevenly over the years. The flickering overhead lights cast long, erratic shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own, stretching and contracting unnaturally. I felt the first flicker of dread, the instinct that told me we were being watched. We moved deeper into the facility, each step heavier than the last. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls covered in strange symbols that I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. The flickering bulbs overhead cast odd shadows that danced and twisted, as though alive. Leah spoke first, her voice a calm anchor in the growing tension. Nothing's coming through on the comms, no signal distortion. Her fingers brushed over the radio controls, adjusting frequencies, but something in her eyes told me she was searching for more than just static. I could see her hesitation. Something was wrong, even if the data didn't reflect it. Avner muttered under his breath as he inspected the walls, tapping them with his knuckles, his fingers leaving faint imprints on the dust that had settled over years of abandonment. "Solid concrete," he said. "No signs of collapse. Whatever happened here, it wasn't from structural damage." His voice was steady, but his eyes kept darting to the shadows, his mind calculating more than the physical space around us. Barak led the way, his steps measured, but his face was unreadable. He'd gone quiet since we entered. The usual sharp focus had morphed into a subtle, unreadable vigilance. I knew the signs. Barak was listening to something none of us could hear, feeling a shift in the air we had yet to recognize. Shira was at the rear, her eyes flicking from one corner to the next, the faintest hint of discomfort in her gaze. Her hand rested lightly on the medical pack slung across her shoulder. She had not spoken much, but I could tell she was on edge, her normally calm demeanor masking the unease settling in her chest. We reached a junction where two more hallways split off into darkness. The temperature dropped noticeably as we moved further into the depths. My breath became visible in the air, the moisture in the corridor coalescing into a fine mist. I felt it on my skin, a strange prickling sensation, as though the air itself had thickened, as though it was no longer quite normal. Barak signaled for a halt. "Leah, check the map again," he ordered, his voice low but firm. Leah tapped the screen of her handheld device, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "This doesn't make sense. The layout, it's not matching what we're seeing." She paused, squinting at the screen. "There's an anomaly in the structure, something. It doesn't exist here." I stepped closer to her, peering over her shoulder at the map. The corridors, the rooms, everything was shifting, changing. The lines on the screen didn't line up with the space we were occupying. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The map was warping, like something was rewriting the layout around us. The first real disturbance came quietly, almost imperceptibly, a faint scraping sound from one of the side rooms. At first, I dismissed it as the facility settling, old pipes or metal groaning under pressure. But then it came again, louder, a deliberate sound, like nails scraping against concrete. Avner was the first to react, stepping toward the sound, his hand moving to the sidearm holstered at his waist. "We're not alone down here," he muttered, his voice a low growl, as he motioned for us to stay back. Shira exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. "It's nothing," she said, but there was a nervous edge in her tone. "Just the place shifting, nothing more." Yet even she knew it wasn't nothing. The sound had felt too purposeful, too deliberate. We waited in silence, the air growing colder by the second. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Just a flicker at the edge of the hallway. A pale figure, too quick to be fully seen, darted into one of the rooms. The shadows in that room seemed to ripple unnaturally as if the darkness itself had come alive. Leah tensed beside me, her fingers already flying across the radio controls. "Leah, what is it?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't respond immediately, but I saw her mouth dry, her face pale in the weak light. "There's something here," she whispered, voice cracking, "but the readings, I can't make sense of them." Barak gestured for us to fall into formation, his body tense as he moved forward with calculated precision. "Stay focused," he commanded. "This is what we came for. Secure the area and continue the search. Everything we need is down here." But I knew, in that moment, that we had crossed an invisible line. The facility was no longer just abandoned. It was a place of presence, a place that had been waiting for us. The shadows seemed thicker, the air denser, the walls whispered. Or perhaps it was just the pressure building inside my head. I couldn't tell anymore. The disturbance began with a shift in the air, a subtle change that none of us could articulate at first. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching into the corners of our vision. The temperature dropped again, but this time, it wasn't just a chill. It felt wrong. Like coldness from a place that had no right to be cold. I noticed it first, standing at the threshold of a narrow hallway. My breath fogged in front of me, unnatural for the depth of the facility. The walls, once damp and decayed, now seemed to pulse, as though something underneath them were moving. I reached out, hesitating before touching the wall, and I felt it. A faint vibration, too consistent to be natural, like a heartbeat faintly emanating from the stone. "Did you feel that?" I whispered, barely audible over the strained hiss of oxygen tanks. No one answered, but I saw the others pause, their movements faltering. Leah's fingers hovered over the comms unit, but she didn't speak. Barack motioned for us to move, but even his steady hand betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He wasn't immune to the shifting atmosphere, to the strange sensation that something beyond our comprehension was beginning to uncoil in the dark. The calm that usually accompanied his every decision had cracked, if only for a moment. We continued, though every step seemed to echo louder in the growing silence. Then, as if triggered by our movement, the first tangible anomaly occurred. From the far end of the hall, a low scraping sound rose again. But this time, it wasn't a faint, distant whisper. It was close. Too close. The noise came from just beyond the corner, from a room I hadn't noticed before, its door partially ajar. Shira tensed beside me. "That's not normal," she said, her voice edged with caution. I motioned to Barack, and we inched toward the open door. The others followed, falling into the formation that had served us so well. As we neared, the scraping stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like nails drumming against the floor, too steady to be the result of any random movement. Leah adjusted her headset, trying to tune into the frequencies around us, but the static seemed to grow thicker, swallowing up her attempts to speak. "It's like the signal is being absorbed," she muttered, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. With a sharp motion, Barack pulled the door open, revealing a narrow room shrouded in darkness. The only illumination came from the flickering lights above, casting strange, jagged shadows across the walls. The room itself was sparse, filled with nothing but a series of large rusted pipes and old machinery, remnants of whatever this facility had once housed. But it wasn't the room itself that unsettled me. It was what was on the floor. There, in the center of the room, was a shape, a collection of old, crumpled papers and blackened metal plates. It looked like nothing more than a discarded pile of debris, but as I stepped closer, the air grew thicker, pressing down on my chest. The papers themselves were moving, slowly, imperceptibly shifting as if something unseen was beneath them, manipulating their weight, their form. I blinked. For a brief moment the room seemed to change, flickering like a corrupted video feed. The walls around us stretched, expanding outward, and the floor tilted in unnatural angles. But then, just as quickly, everything returned to its original state. I shook my head, trying to clear the disorienting sensation. It's nothing," Shira said, though her voice lacked conviction. She stepped into the room and reached down, hesitating only for a moment before touching the papers. They were cold, unfamiliar cold, not from the temperature but from something deeper, something that crawled under her skin. The moment her fingers brushed the papers, the tapping sound stopped. The room went eerily silent. Then, the strangest thing happened. The pile of debris seemed to breathe. It rose slowly, not like an animal but like a living entity stretching in its sleep. We all froze, unable to speak as the shadows in the room shifted again. It was as if the darkness had gained weight, as if the very air had become more substantial, more oppressive. The walls felt closer now, the space shrinking around us. "Get out of there," Barack ordered, his voice tight, the command terse, but we were already moving. Shira stood frozen for just a moment longer, eyes wide, and then, with one final glance at the strange, shifting pile of debris, she retreated with the rest of us. The door slammed shut behind us and the room fell silent once again. But the unease remained. The scrape of nails against concrete, the rhythm that seemed to have no origin, lingered in the edges of my hearing. The temperature, still unnaturally low, gnawed at our skin, as though the facility itself had marked us. And I knew with a creeping certainty that this was only the beginning. Something had been waiting for us down here. Something that had never fully left. The facility seemed to shift as we moved deeper into its corridors, as if the walls themselves had begun to take on a life of their own. The shadows we passed in the narrow halls were too thick, too dense, as if they had been stretched, pulled, and reshaped by some unseen hand. We tried to maintain composure. Barak kept his focus, his eyes scanning every corner with military precision. But I could see it in his posture. There was a tension, a stiffness that wasn't there before. The others were silent, but I could feel the unease in the air, thick enough to choke on. Leah was the first to notice something odd. Her voice, usually steady and analytical, was clipped as she spoke. "The footage feed," she said, her fingers flying across the portable monitor she carried. "It's distorted." "Distorted how?" I asked, glancing at her screen. The image flickered, lines of static slicing across the display. Then for a moment it cleared, revealing a corridor that we had just passed. But something was wrong. The shadows in the image were not where they should be. They were wrong, too dark, too alive. They stretched in unnatural ways, reaching toward the camera, curling like tendrils of smoke. "We need to move," Barak said, his voice tight. "Keep your focus. Stay in formation." But it was too late. As we continued down the hallway, we noticed the first set of footprints, fresh, clear. They led down a side passage, where the floor was littered with dirt and dust that had not been disturbed by our boots. The prints were too precise to be random, a perfectly measured stride, as if whoever made them had been walking with an exactness we had not encountered before. "Who's ahead of us?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Barak's eyes narrowed. "No one." He turned to Leah. "Can you track them?" Leah shook her head, her brow furrowed in confusion. "There's no interference in the signal. But these prints, they don't make sense. They shouldn't be here." The footprints led us deeper into the maze of tunnels, and with each step, the atmosphere thickened. The walls seemed to lean inward, and the air grew colder still, an oppressive chill that gnawed at the edges of our senses. The silence around us became deafening, each breath we took amplified in our ears. The faint hissing of our oxygen tanks, the only sound, felt louder and louder. Then, the first flicker occurred. At first, it was just a brief flash at the edge of my vision. An after-image, I thought, but it repeated. A figure, tall and thin, its features blurred by shadows, stood at the far end of the corridor. It was there for a second, and then it was gone, like smoke dissipating in the air. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Barak's eyes flicked toward the spot where I had seen the figure. His jaw tightened. "Move forward," he ordered, but there was hesitation in his voice. The command was more urgent, and yet the fear he had been hiding was starting to slip through the cracks. We pushed forward. The flickers intensified, the shadows growing longer with each turn we made. At one point, we passed an old office, its door ajar. As we moved past, the fluorescent lights within flickered to life, illuminating a space that had been untouched for decades. Inside, the room was filled with strange, forgotten equipment, metal boxes and old consoles. Wires sprawled across the floor like the veins of some giant dead creature. The walls were lined with cabinets, but they were open, empty, save for more strange symbols carved into the wood, some still glowing faintly. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I heard it then, the whisper. A low, almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to come from all around us. It was too faint to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. foreign, guttural, as though something ancient, something otherworldly, was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Shira was the first to react. Her face drained of color, and she reached for her medical pack, as though seeking some comfort in the routine, but the trembling of her hands betrayed her. "I don't like this," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't right." We continued moving, but the shadows around us grew heavier, more solid. We passed through another doorway, and there, in the middle of the room, was the next set of footprints. But this time, they were different. These were not human. They were deep, wide, with elongated toes, dragging along the floor as if something larger and far more grotesque had passed through here. Suddenly, the air pressure shifted. I could feel it, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. The walls seemed to be closing in, and the flickering lights above us became erratic, flashing faster, then slowing to a crawl, as if time itself was beginning to fragment. "Get out of here," Barak growled, his voice now tight with urgency. But we didn't move. We couldn't. The shadows on the walls moved again, only this time they did not retreat when we turned to face them. They pressed forward, curling around the edges of the room like sentient things, responding to our every motion, following our every step. I saw the figure again. It was closer this time, its face still shrouded in shadow, but this time I felt its presence, not as a flicker of the eye, but as something solid, as though the room itself had birthed it from the darkness. Leah's voice cut through the silence. "There's something in the air," she said, her voice strained. "Something moving through the signal. I can't track it. It's not just the facility. It's like the space itself is changing." Before anyone could respond, the floor beneath us groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the soles of our boots. And then, without warning, the flickering lights died completely. The room plunged into darkness, the oppressive silence swallowing everything, even the distant hum of our oxygen tanks. It felt as if the very air had frozen, and for a moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the crushing weight of stillness pressing in from all sides. "Leah, can you get the lights back?" Barak's voice cracked the tension, sharp and urgent, but there was no answer. I heard the faint clicking of Leah's fingers tapping at her equipment, but nothing changed. The darkness held firm. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably heavy. They didn't belong to any of us. These steps were too solid, too resonant, reverberating through the floor as though something massive was moving through the space, its weight sinking deep into the concrete. Shira's breath hitched beside me. "It's close," she whispered, her voice trembling. I could feel her gripping the side of my jacket, the pressure of her hand telling me all I needed to know. She was as scared as I was. A low, guttural sound reached my ears then. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a vibration that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It was a humming, vibrating resonance that threaded through my bones. A pulse that made the ground beneath my feet feel unstable. The air, now thick and electric, seemed to hum with a presence that was older than any of us. Leah finally spoke, her voice low and strangled. "Something's wrong. I can't triangulate. Nothing is where it should be. The signals, they're warping." Suddenly, the lights flickered back to life. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Movement at the far end of the hallway. A flash of a figure. I wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light, but then the flickering stopped, and the figure was unmistakable. It stood at the far end of the room, a towering silhouette framed by the dim light. Its body was impossibly thin, unnaturally tall, its limbs elongated and distorted. It seemed to fold and stretch in ways no human form could. The shadows that clung to its body moved like liquid, swirling and twisting with a life of their own, pooling around the floor and up the walls. I couldn't take my eyes off it. There was no face, no distinct features, just a pale, shifting outline where a human should have been. And yet, it had an unmistakable presence, something intangible that I felt in the pit of my stomach, something that wasn't bound by the rules of this world. It was wrong. It was as if it had crawled from some space beyond reality, beyond time. A place where the laws of nature and physics no longer applied. A thing that had no need to move, because its very existence bent the air and the light around it. The shadows surrounding it grew thicker, spreading like ink spilled across a page, creeping across the walls and floor. For a brief, horrifying second, I thought the shadows were trying to climb toward us, reaching out like fingers, grasping at our legs, our arms. The walls, too, seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in time with the creature's presence. Barak was the first to react, his voice a low command. "Stay calm. We don't engage unless—" His voice faltered. The figure took a step forward, and the room seemed to tilt, the ground under my feet momentarily shifting. The air turned colder, as if every breath I took was drawing me deeper into the thing's grip. I couldn't focus. The shadows seemed to blur the edges of reality, warping my senses, distorting time itself. I felt a pressure building in my chest, a crushing weight that grew with every passing second. My body screamed for me to move, but my legs refused to obey. It was as if the room had drawn its own gravity and we were its prisoners. Then, the whispers began. Soft at first, just beyond the threshold of hearing. I could feel the sound vibrating against my skin, not through my ears, but through something deeper, something primal. It was a voice, but not in any language I had ever heard. It was a sound that resonated with a part of me I didn't recognize, a deep, instinctual part that had no words, only the knowledge that we should not be here. "Get back," Barak ordered, but his voice was drowned by the growing hum that seemed to envelop us. He raised his weapon, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. I saw the realization, the terror that he knew, but could not express. He knew that this wasn't just a threat we could fight. This was something else. The entity took another step forward, and then, in the flickering light, I saw it, an eye. One pale, luminous orb that seemed to pierce the air itself, locking onto me with an intelligence that was older than time. It was not the gaze of a creature or even a being. It was the gaze of everything that had ever existed, all at once. I couldn't move. The shadows closed in around us. The entity extended one of its arms, too long, too thin, and as it moved, I saw what it was reaching for. It wasn't us. It was the walls, the shadows, the air itself. It was manipulating the very fabric of space. "We need to leave now," I managed to rasp, but the words were stolen by the deafening pressure building in my chest. The room tilted again, my vision blurred. I felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath me. My head spun, and I realized we were no longer standing in the hallway. The world was wrong. Time was bending in strange ways, collapsing in on itself. Barak shouted something, but his voice was swallowed by the growing hum. I could see his face, pale, drawn, his eyes wide with a kind of terror I had never seen in him before. Then, everything went black. When I regained consciousness, the world had shifted. The first thing I became aware of was the silence. It was not the peaceful kind of quiet you would expect in an abandoned facility, but an oppressive silence, one that felt unnatural, as if sound itself was being restrained. My body felt heavy, my limbs stiff, as though I had been asleep for much longer than I had. My mind was clouded, filled with fragments of thoughts, glimpses of the creature, the overwhelming hum, the crushing weight in my chest. But it was all distant, blurred by the fog of whatever had happened. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and slowly became aware of my surroundings. The walls around me were no longer the decaying stone I had seen earlier. Instead, they seemed to ripple, alive with strange symbols that twisted and shifted as if they were part of something far beyond our comprehension. The light above me flickered in erratic patterns, casting shadows that danced, moved, reached. Leah was the first to speak, her voice quiet but sharp. "What the hell is happening?" she muttered, her hands shaking as she adjusted the comms gear. She looked different. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. Her normally steady hands were trembling, not from fear, but from something else. Barak stood to my left, his posture rigid, almost mechanical. His face was pale, the lines of stress carved deeper than before, his eyes hollow, as if he had been drained of something vital. His gaze shifted toward me, and there was a strange emptiness in it, a distance that wasn't there before. "Where's Avner?" I asked. But the words felt wrong, hollow, like they didn't belong in this place. The air around us seemed to vibrate with a low hum, distorting my perception of time and space. The room, no, the corridor, seemed to stretch unnaturally before me, distorting in ways I couldn't explain. Shira stumbled forward, her steps faltering. He's not here." Her voice trembled, her hands pressed against her temples as if she were trying to hold her own sanity together. I don't remember anything past the room, the thing." My heart raced as I looked around at the others. The silence had taken on a different tone. It was like a vacuum, sucking the life out of the space around us. The corridor stretched impossibly long, its walls folding in on themselves like paper being crumpled, the floor beneath us warping and shifting as if reality itself was collapsing. Leah looked at the map on her screen, then back at us, her face contorting in confusion. The map. It's gone. The facility. It's changing. Nothing makes sense. The rooms are shifting. The hallways." She paused, her voice faltering. "It's like they're merging." Barak's face darkened. "We need to get out." His voice, usually firm, was now laced with uncertainty. "Stay together. Move fast. No one breaks formation." But it was already too late. The flickering lights above us grew brighter, the air vibrating with an almost electric energy. It felt as if the building was reacting to us, feeding off our fear, our confusion. And then, the floor beneath our feet shuddered, the walls groaning, a deep reverberating sound that echoed in my skull. Without warning, the shadows, those damn shadows, shifted. They stretched, elongated, twisting and writhing like serpents in the dark. And then, the entity, the thing we had seen before, manifested again. It didn't step into the room. It was the room. Its body rippled in and out of existence, bending reality around it. Its presence distorted everything in its vicinity, the walls, the air, the time. Everything was warped in its wake. But it wasn't just the entity that had changed. We had. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. No, something was happening to me, to all of us. I could feel it in my skin, a crawling sensation that was both foreign and familiar. My vision blurred again, and the world seemed to pulse around me. For a moment, I thought I saw a faint image of something, someone, moving in the corner of my vision. It was a figure, one of us, but not quite. Then it hit me. Avner. It was Avner, but his form was not the one I remembered. His body was grotesque, swollen and contorted, his limbs twisting in unnatural angles. His eyes were hollow, dark, like windows into a void. He was there, but he wasn't. He stood in the corner, an empty shell, flickering in and out of reality like a half-formed ghost. Shira gasped, her voice cracking as she turned to Barak. What happened to him? Barak didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on Avner, and I saw the recognition in his gaze. But it was not the recognition of a man he had worked with for years. It was the look of someone who had forgotten who they were. Get away from him, Barak snapped, his voice harsh. Now! But even as he said it, his own face seemed to shift in the dim light, his features warping into something unfamiliar, something wrong. Leah, too, was no longer the calm, analytical mind I had known. Her hands twitched uncontrollably, the fingers curling as though they were moving of their own volition. Her lips parted, and for a brief moment she whispered something that was not in any language I had heard. The creature in the center of the room, if it could be called a creature, shifted again. Its form seemed to crack, its shape warping as the walls and shadows bent toward it, feeding it, fueling it. The walls sang now, the hum filling the space like a lullaby of chaos. I felt the pull, the weight of it, like gravity itself was warping around us. "We're too late," I whispered, my voice hollow, my mind spinning. "We've opened it. We've opened the door. Everything around us fractured." The room collapsed into chaos. The walls twisted and buckled, their once solid structure warping into something unrecognizable, as though the very foundations of reality were disassembling in front of us. The flickering lights above us dimmed further, the shadows now alive, crawling across the floor, licking the air like hungry flames. We were no longer in a facility, but a living nightmare where the laws of space and time had lost all meaning. Barak staggered back, his hands outstretched as though trying to steady himself against the shifting air. But he was no longer the captain, the man who led us with calm precision. His eyes were wide, unseeing, as if someone, had overtaken him. His face twisted, as if his very soul were being rewritten before our eyes. "Barak!" I shouted, but my voice felt distant, as though I was speaking through a wall of glass. My chest tightened, the weight of the room pressing in. The air had become suffocating, filled with the taste of metal, of ozone, and of something ancient, something alive. Avner's figure flickered in the corner of the room, his grotesque shifting form still standing there, a broken reflection of what he had once been. His limbs twisted, his face contorted, his skin stretching and folding unnaturally, as though reality itself rejected him. The more I looked at him, the more his image seemed to fragment, like pieces of a shattered mirror held together by a cruel, invisible hand. And then from the center of the room, the entity, it, moved. Slowly, but with terrifying inevitability. Its presence filled the space, expanding like ink in water, reaching out, folding the shadows, folding the air itself into its grasp. Its pale, formless shape loomed above us, distorting the space around it. The hum, the low vibration grew louder, pressing into my skull, a sound so deep, so ancient it was beyond comprehension. I tried to move, but my body felt frozen, rooted to the floor as if I had been bound by invisible chains. My thoughts were no longer my own, twisted and warped by the overwhelming presence. It felt like a force from outside the boundaries of human understanding, an intelligence so vast and patient that it made our entire existence seem insignificant, like dust caught in a storm. Leah, her hands trembling, muttered something under her breath. "It's calling us. It's waiting for us." Her voice cracked, breaking with an edge of terror I had never heard before. "Get out!" I screamed, but my words were swallowed by the oppressive hum. My body refused to respond, paralyzed by fear, by the weight of the thing at the center of this fractured space. I turned to Shira. She was standing beside me, her eyes wide, her mouth moving, but no sound came out. Her expression was one of total horror, as if she had been confronted with something she could not understand, something that had shattered her very perception of reality. Her fingers twitched, reaching out as if to grasp something unseen, and then there was a flicker. The lights overhead stuttered once, twice before dying completely, plunging the room into an even deeper darkness. But the presence of the entity did not diminish. In fact, it intensified. The shadows around us swirled, their edges sharp and jagged, as if they were no longer mere absences of light, but extensions of something far more dangerous, something that belonged to the darkness. The floor beneath us groaned as the entity reached out, its shape pulsing, expanding, filling the room with a dreadful, inescapable weight. The walls shifted again, warping in impossible directions. And then, contact. I felt it before I saw it. A pressure in my chest, a slow, agonizing squeeze, as if something cold and ancient was crawling under my skin. The air seemed to thicken, and I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, my thoughts fractured into jagged pieces as I felt something enter me. Something else was inside my mind now, weaving its presence through my very soul. I gasped, struggling to remain conscious, but it was as if the thing was feeding on my very essence. I saw fleeting images, flashes of alien landscapes, ancient cities crumbling under a sky that had never known stars. I saw creatures, not like us, but twisted and vast, moving through dimensions that made no sense. I heard voices, millions of voices, murmuring in a language that was not meant for human ears. "Please help me," Shira whispered. her voice shaking with an unholy desperation. I looked at her, and I saw it. Her eyes, staring back at me with a depth of terror I could never have imagined. Then, the entity spoke. Its voice was not a voice, but a feeling, a vibration that filled my bones and echoed in my mind. It was the sound of everything, and yet, it was nothing. It was as if the universe itself had whispered in my ear, as if it had always known us, watched us, and would continue to watch us for all eternity. "You are not alone," it murmured. The words were not spoken. They were felt, pressing against the very fabric of my being. "You are merely a fleeting thought, a flicker in the void." The pressure in my chest increased, the sensation of something crawling deeper into my mind, into my memories. I saw the faces of my comrades, twisted and distorted, their bodies flickering in and out of reality. And then something changed. The walls shuddered again. The floor beneath us groaned as if something immense was moving within the very structure of the facility. Time itself seemed to stretch, slowing, warping. The very air itself seemed to bend, folding in on us, becoming a prison we could not escape. Barack's voice broke through, ragged and strained. "Get out! Now!" But I knew. We couldn't. There was no escape. The air was thick now, oppressive, heavy with the weight of what surrounded us. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass, sharp, painful, and slow. I could barely move. My body felt trapped in place, the world around me folding, twisting, reshaping, as though the very fabric of existence had been altered by the entity's presence. Barack's command had come, but there was no action to accompany it. His voice, once firm and authoritative, now faltered, as if even he could no longer believe in the hope of escape. "Move!" he shouted again. But it was more a plea than an order. He reached for his weapon, his hands trembling, but his body, his very presence, seemed diminished, as if the force of what had invaded this place was leeching away his strength. I struggled to find my bearings, my legs feeling like lead. Every movement was agonizingly slow, as though the very space around us was resisting our escape. The walls, the air, even the floor beneath us. Everything was alive with unnatural energy, pressing in, bending around us. We were prisoners in our own bodies, and the facility, the very structure of reality itself, was the prison. "Leah," I called out, though the words felt hollow, barely escaping my lips. Can you get the comms back up?" Leah didn't respond at first. She was standing in place, her head lowered, as if struggling against an invisible force. Her fingers twitched, moving across the comms gear, but the expression on her face was distant, as if she had already lost the battle. The air around her shimmered, warping the light in ways that didn't make sense. The sound, the hum, grew louder. It was no longer just a background noise. It was the heartbeat of this place, the thrum of something ancient and incomprehensible. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through my skull, pressing down on my chest. It was the presence, the entity, that was shaping this world into something else. I turned to Shira, her face pale, her eyes wide with a kind of primal fear I had never seen in her before. Her breathing was shallow, quick, as though she too could feel the weight of the entity's gaze pressing into her. "Shira, we need to move." Her gaze met mine, and for a split second there was a flash of recognition, a brief fleeting moment where she saw me, where she was with me. But then, that moment dissolved, and she staggered forward, her hand reaching out for anything, as though trying to grasp onto something familiar in a world that no longer made sense. "Help me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help me, please." I wanted to reach for her, but the floor beneath my feet shuddered again, and a low, rumbling sound filled the air. It was the creature, it, pressing closer. The shadows around us thickened, swirling with unnatural speed, constricting the space between us. I saw it then. Its eyes, or what could have been eyes, glowing faintly in the flickering light, locking onto each of us, one by one. I turned to Barack, whose face was now completely drained of color, his eyes hollow. "We need to leave." "Now," I said, forcing the words out, though I knew the truth in my gut. There was no escaping this. There never had been. Barack didn't respond. His hands gripped his weapon tighter, knuckles white, but he wasn't looking at us anymore. His gaze was fixed on something ahead, something I couldn't see. His lips moved, but no sound escaped. The space around us pulsed. The walls shuddered again, this time violently, the ground beneath us cracking. I could hear the facility itself screaming in agony, the structure groaning as it twisted and stretched in ways that defied all reason. "We're too late," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "It's too late." The corridor seemed to elongate before our eyes, stretching farther than it should have, twisting around in impossible angles. There were no exits, no way out. The doors had disappeared. The path we had come down was no longer there. We were trapped in an endless loop of shifting halls, each corner more distorted than the last. Time itself was bending, warping, like a rubber band pulled too tight. I looked back at Avner's flickering figure, now almost entirely consumed by the shadows. His body was almost unrecognizable, a grotesque mockery of his former self. The shadows that had clung to him were now alive, writhing and expanding, moving with a will of their own. He was no longer a person. He was part of it, part of the thing that had invaded our world. "Barack!" I shouted, my voice rising in panic. "Barack!" But he didn't move. His eyes were locked on the walls, and I could see it now. His memory was slipping. The Barack I had known was fading, his mind undone by the same force that had altered everything around us. Shira cried out beside me, her hands clutching at her chest. "We can't leave! We can't leave!" The floor began to crack beneath us, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the facility itself was disintegrating, not just physically, but in every possible way. The shadows, the air, the space around us, all of it was breaking down, collapsing into something else, something ancient. I turned to Leah. "We have to go. We have to find a way." But the words died in my throat as the walls, the shadows, and the space itself seemed to pulse. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the world felt different. The air was thick, as though the atmosphere itself had changed, become denser, and the sounds, distant at first, seemed to buzz in my skull, like a low hum reverberating deep within. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, and even then, what I saw didn't feel entirely real. I was lying on cold concrete, the sharp metallic taste of blood in my mouth, and I realized with a sickening jolt that my limbs were covered in something wet. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to find some sign of my team, but there was nothing. No Barack, no Leah, no Shira. I pushed myself up with shaking hands, my body aching, every muscle protesting against the movement. The room around me was unfamiliar, more like a dream than reality. The walls, though familiar, were warped, bent as if viewed through broken glass. The air shimmered with strange distortions, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. My head swam as if the very laws of nature had been twisted, like the space was a page from an ancient book being rewritten in real time. My first instinct was to call out to my team, but when I opened my mouth, the words felt foreign, too hollow. The air tasted wrong, the familiar sharpness of the Berlin streets now replaced by a metallic, coppery tang that I couldn't shake from my throat. I stumbled to my feet, the ground beneath me shifting with every step, as though the floor was no longer a fixed surface, but something fluid, like liquid stone. I barely managed to take a few steps before I heard movement from behind me. Turning quickly, my eyes fell on the figure of Shira. She was standing there, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me with a level of intensity I hadn't seen before. She looked the same, but not. Her face was paler, her movement slower, almost mechanical, as if she were operating on some distant, far-off logic. "Shira?" I whispered, the name coming out like a question, a plea. But she didn't answer. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her body jerking as though something was inside her, controlling her movements. I noticed then that her hands, her fingers, were wrong. They twitched and spasmed, curled unnaturally, as though something within her had overtaken the fine control of her nervous system. Shira, I repeated, louder this time, my voice trembling. She blinked once, twice, but when she looked at me again, her eyes were empty, hollow. Her lips parted slightly, but the words she spoke weren't hers. Time, she whispered, her voice distant, like a soft echo of someone who had been long forgotten. Time is broken. I stepped back, my chest tight, a cold shiver running down my spine. What do you mean? Her head tilted slightly, the movement jerky, unnatural. The walls, they speak, she muttered, her voice tinged with something I couldn't place. They remember. Us. I wanted to run. My mind screamed for me to leave, to get away from this thing that had once been Shira. But my body didn't respond. I felt rooted to the spot, frozen in place as her eyes, dark and distant, stared into me. The pressure in the room grew heavier, thick with an unnatural energy. I could feel my body being pulled deeper into the oppressive force that surrounded us. It was then that I saw her. Leah. She was standing at the far end of the room, her body hunched and trembling, her fingers twitching as though trying to grasp at something just beyond reach. The way she stood. It wasn't right. Her posture was too rigid, too controlled, as if some invisible hand was puppeteering her movements. Leah? My voice was barely a whisper. She turned toward me, her eyes wide, unblinking. But they were not Leah's eyes. Not anymore. Her pupils were dilated, her gaze empty. Her lips moved, but there was no recognition, only a chilling mechanical tone. It calls, she said, her voice warped, distorted. It sees you. I took a step back, my breath shallow, panic rising in my chest. What had happened to them? What had we become? Shira took another slow step toward me, her face still expressionless. We are its echoes, she said, her voice in eerie harmony with Leah's distorted tone. We were always its echoes. I staggered backward, trying to make sense of the words, trying to understand what had changed. But my mind was failing me, distorted like everything else in this space. The walls around me pressed in again, the air thick with a tangible dread. I could feel the weight of time bending, warping, as though it was no longer linear, no longer coherent. The world, my world, was unraveling. And I could no longer tell where it ended and where the thing that had invaded us began. The world I had known no longer existed. When I awoke, everything had changed, and the facility we had been trapped in had evaporated, replaced by something else, something alien. The memories I had were fractured, broken into jagged pieces. There was no clear line between what was real and what was a consequence of the encounter. I found myself back in the sterile, dimly lit interrogation room, sitting in a metal chair, the coldness of the chair seeping into my bones. The air was thin, controlled, as if the very oxygen had been filtered of any impurities. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. Across from me sat a figure I recognized, Major Elias. His face was calm, too calm, his demeanor clinical, detached. His eyes, hidden behind reflective glasses, stared at me with an unsettling indifference. His hands rested on the table, fingers steepled in front of him, the posture almost rehearsed. "Agent," he began, his voice measured, as though reading from a script he had recited 100 times. "We are here to debrief you regarding the events of the operation." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. The memory of what had happened, the entity, the shifting walls, my team, Shira, Leah, Barak, all of it felt distant, as if it had happened to someone else. "You were the only survivor," Major Elias continued, his voice cutting through my foggy thoughts. "Your mission was compromised, but the data—" He paused, leaning forward slightly. "The data you returned with was invaluable." I blinked, the fog lifting just enough to understand his words. "What data?" I managed to rasp, my throat dry, my mouth tasting like metal. Elias did not respond immediately. Instead, he slid a file across the table toward me. I reached for it, the weight of the paper thick and foreign in my hands. The pages inside were full of diagrams, symbols I didn't recognize, blueprints of things I couldn't comprehend. The words blurred as I read them, like they were written in a language just outside my grasp. "These files," Elias said, breaking the silence, "are to be treated as classified. They are to be erased from your memory at the end of this debriefing." The words settled like lead in my stomach. "Erased?" I whispered. "Yes." He said it without hesitation, without emotion. "The truth, Agent, is not something the world is ready for. The government cannot afford to allow the nature of this incident to become public knowledge. The entities, the anomalous forces at play, everything you've encountered, is not part of our world, and it will not be allowed to be." I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "You're going to wipe my memory?" The question felt hollow, as if it no longer mattered. "Yes," he said, his gaze unwavering. "For your protection, for the protection of others." I opened my mouth to speak, to argue, but the words died before they could take shape. How could I explain? How could I prove what had happened? The walls, the shadows, the flickering presence that had haunted us in that facility, none of it had been real, not in the sense that anyone outside this room would ever understand. The truth had become a shapeless, fractured thing, lost in the spaces between dimensions. Leaning back in his chair, Major Elias folded his hands together. "This was a containment breach," he said, as if explaining to a child. "A lapse in the boundaries of our world, a slip between the folds of reality. It is something other, something ancient, and it was never meant to be discovered." I could feel my pulse quicken, the pressure building again in my chest. Something inside me screamed, "They don't understand." The truth was too vast, too dangerous for them to even attempt to grasp. But what did it matter? I had returned, I had survived, and now they would erase me, erase us all. "You are dismissed," Elias said, his tone final. "Your file will be sealed, and you will be reassigned. A new identity will be created for you, Agent." He paused, almost as an afterthought. "A life that has no connection to what transpired." I stood, the weight of the file in my hands now feeling like a dead weight. The door clicked open, but before I could leave, Elias spoke again, his voice like ice. "Agent, remember, none of this ever happened. You will remember nothing of what you have witnessed." His words echoed in my mind as I stepped out of the room, but something inside me resisted. The memory was there, burning in the back of my mind. But the more I tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped away. The more it dissolved into the fog that had been carefully built around it. I returned to my new quarters, though they felt empty, devoid of meaning, like a shell that had been hollowed out. The apartment was small, clinical, but efficient, exactly what I had been given as part of my reassignment. The walls were bare, the furniture sterile and clean. Everything was arranged with military precision, as if my life had been reduced to a series of neutral spaces, a backdrop for something that no longer had purpose. The strange thing was that nothing had changed on the surface. I followed the new routines, checked my new identification, adhered to the instructions given to me by the government officials who had erased the past. But something inside me resisted, something deep within my soul that refused to forget what had happened. The truth lingered in the corners of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I sat at my desk, staring at the blank screen of my computer. The digital clock on the wall ticked monotonously, a reminder of time's relentless march forward. Yet I felt as though time had stopped. I tried to write my report, the one they had assigned to me, the sanitized version, the lie that had been pre-written, but the words wouldn't come. Every time I tried to type, my fingers froze. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed to move with a life of their own. They stretched, writhing and bending unnaturally, their shapes flickering with dark, ghostly forms. I looked at them, and they seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on me like the weight of the past itself. I turned on the lamp beside my desk, but the shadows only deepened. The lights in the apartment flickered erratically, casting shifting shapes across the walls. The buzzing of the fluorescent light overhead grew louder, like a constant, nagging hum in the background of my thoughts. As I sat there, Staring at the computer screen, I could feel it. The oppressive weight of something waiting, watching. The silence of the room was deafening, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to press in from all sides. I glanced at the clock again. 12:17 a.m. The time was wrong. The clock blinked and then reset itself, only to show the same time again, 12:17 a.m. I tried to tell myself it was a malfunction, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The numbers on the screen didn't match the weight of reality. They felt off, like the time was deliberately being distorted, manipulated, pulled into another dimension I couldn't understand. I stood up, walking across the room toward the door. The hallway beyond felt longer than it should have been, the shadows darker, more threatening. As I reached for the handle, I heard it, a sound coming from the other side of the door. Heavy footsteps, too loud for a human. They moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each step resounding with unnatural weight. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned slowly, glancing back at the room behind me. The shadows were moving again, this time with more purpose, more intent. They stretched, reaching toward me as if they had a mind of their own. My breath quickened, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I heard it. A voice, soft but unmistakable, echoing through the room. It wasn't my voice, but something familiar, something from the depths of my memory. You can't escape it. The words echoed in my mind, and I knew deep down that they were true. There was no escape, not from the thing we had uncovered, not from what we had unleashed. It had always been there, waiting. The walls, the shadows, the entity. It was all connected, and it would always be there, in the dark corners of my mind, waiting for me to remember. I reached for the door again, but the handle wouldn't turn. It felt as if something on the other side was holding it shut, as if something bigger than me was preventing my escape. The air was thick now, suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the presence pressing against me, filling the room with an unnatural force. My watch, which I hadn't even noticed before, began to tick louder, each second stretching longer than the last. I glanced down at the display, and it was wrong. The time was distorted, out of sync with reality. The seconds were moving backward, and the numbers were shifting in impossible ways. And then I saw it. The shadows on the wall were not shadows anymore. They were figures, humanoid in shape but twisted, their forms shifting and flickering like a broken film reel. They were watching me, waiting. Their eyes glowed faintly, and the air hummed with a low, resonant sound. The footsteps outside the door grew louder, closer. I backed away, my body trembling with fear, and I heard the voice again, this time louder, clearer. It doesn't need to destroy us. It can wait for us to finish destroying ourselves. I looked at the watch one final time, 12:17 a.m. The hands had stopped moving.